Now, today we're talking about the Byzantine Empire, and the main city of interest there is Constantinople. In fact, when Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, that's the official end of the Byzantine Empire. But Constantinople is still a big city, still a very important city. It's been named Istanbul. Turkey is today an Islamic country, and it's still extremely popular, and it still does serve as a sort of middle hub between the eastern and western parts of the world. Still regulates commercial traffic through, I think it's called the Strait of Gibraltar. No, Strait of Malacca, I think. But anyway, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Now, when it comes to the Byzantine Empire, I'm a big fan of the Roman Empire. Grew up, love the Romans. I think they're fascinating. And I was always depressed in my history classes when my professors would talk about the fall of Rome. But again, like the fall of Constantinople, the fall of Rome is debatable too. Is Rome still a city? Sure. Is Rome still important? Well, ask the 1 billion roughly Christians that trace their ancestry back to Rome and Constantinople. And Constantine, the Roman emperor. So yeah, of course it's important. And while perhaps the leaders change through time, it still remains important. But when we begin to talk about the Byzantine Empire, it begins, of course, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, around 476 AD. And again, as I said, that's a debatable time too. That was just simply the last successful invasion by barbarian hordes or migrants or whoever. And then the Eastern Roman Empire endured for another 1,000 years, roughly. Now, the most important early ruler of the Byzantine Empire is Justinian. And married to Theodora, his very strong-willed, very capable wife. In fact, she was just as powerful a ruler in many ways as he was. And he was determined to rebuild the Roman Empire. Now, Western civilization owes a great debt to the Roman Empire in terms of how we structure our society, how we build our buildings, even the way we play football. I feel like the gladiator culture kind of translates into football well. But he was determined to rebuild the traditional Roman Empire, not just in the concepts and cultures and the way that we have, but the actual Roman Empire, the Mediterranean, North African, Gaul, Germanics, Britannia. He wanted to reconquer all of this. He had a very successful general named Belisarius, and he had managed to defeat and reconquer almost, by the end of Justinian's reign, almost the entire former Western Roman Empire. It's quite impressive, really. Stretched from Italy to North Africa to the Middle East. However, while Justinian's reign was extremely impressive, and we're going to talk about him for a few minutes, especially his contributions to law, which translate a lot to modern day, a lot of the territory that he conquered crumbled. These places looked for their opportunity to gain their independence. Sure enough, they did. But his best contribution here is Roman law. Codification of Roman law. That simply means he wrote it down in a usable manner. This is his most lasting contribution. His code of laws is called the corpus. And you may have heard this word before from habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln suspended this during the Civil War. This is a person's right to appear in court. So if Trek went out and ran over an old lady, he'd have his right to make his case, even if he intentionally ran over the old lady in the road. He'd still have his right to make his case. Why? It's called habeas corpus of the law. This is a Byzantine concept. But it wasn't the only book he wrote. In fact, his people wrote the Digest, collection of writings from Roman juries, the Institutes, a textbook on Roman law, the how to implement this in your society, the novels, which was a collection of just important rulings that Justinian made. In fact, in many ways, the corpus reminds me of the Islamic Quran, and the novels reminds me of Sharia law. So the Quran is the Islamic body of law. Sharia law is Muhammad's example. And then finally, these were in effect until the fall of Constantinople and have had a profound influence on the legal systems in the United States among most Western countries. So here's the Emperor Justinian in the center, of course. And this is a mosaic, meaning this is a collection of many thousands of different small pieces of glass plastered onto stone, I would assume. This is from an old Roman town. In fact, I think this one may be from Pompeii. The church there is full of mosaics. And there's several things we can see from this. Number one, that the emperor is the head of the state. We can see this for one because, of course, he's in the center. In most paintings, the center, think of Raphael, or think of Leonardo's Last Supper. Jesus is in the center. In fact, we'll look at the Last Supper in a moment. But also, look at the halo around him. That says something about him, that he was not only the head of the state. You see the jeweled crown. I wish I had my laser pointer. But he's also the head of the church. And that's not only the halo effect going on, but the golden bowl that he's holding. So I just thought it was neat to point out here, this is one of the most impressive Christian churches ever built. This is not St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, although I really want to see that one. This is the Hagia Sophia, meaning the Church of the Holy Wisdom. which of course Constantinople was conquered by the Turks, and so it was renamed Istanbul, which is located in Turkey, no longer called Anatolia. But the emperor built this magnificent church. How did he do it? Well, for one, the city of Constantinople had been frequently destroyed. Earlier by riots. One of the most popular buildings there was the Hippodrome. Chariot races were held there. It could hold up to 60,000 spectators. Think of it as the Roman version of Daytona. Actually, I've got a clip to show you of the Hippodrome. It's really cool. But if you've ever been to a soccer game in Europe or South America, or even really a pretty heated football game here, you know these things can get violent. I was at a soccer game in Brazil, and on the way in game day traffic, they arrested an entire bus full of people for knocking the side of the bus out. During the game, cops drug a guy out of the game for throwing a cherry bomb at them. During the game, sporting events can become violent, even more so in other countries, especially with soccer for some reason. But it was such the case with chariot races in the Byzantine Empire. So a few facts about the Hagia Sophia. For one, 42 windows at the dome's base, which this picture is the best I can give you. If you're standing inside of it, the ceiling appears to be floating, which is pretty impressive for a middle-aged building when you think about it. Better picture of it. A few things. This is, of course, in Constantinople, constructed during Justinian's reign. I did want to point out, you see Muslim symbols. That's fascinating to me. Why would we be seeing Muslim symbols inside a Christian church? They converted it, right. It was conquered by who? Muslims, exactly. So, constructed under the reign of Justinian, the most impressive Christian church ever in its time, but it's not even a church anymore. Some of the stones come from a temple to Diana in Ephesus, which, if memory serves, Ephesus was mentioned in the New Testament as one of the places that the Apostle Paul traveled, and it was also a Greek city-state, which again, we'll talk about the influence of the Greeks on the Middle Ages in just a moment. Wins, and then goes on to become Moses later, so go figure. And then head of the NRA, so I don't know about him. But anyway, more about Justinian. When Justinian died, he became, actually left quite an impressive legacy as one of the most important rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire, which is quite impressive when you consider they have a history going all the way back to before the Common Era, lasting over 1,400 to 1,500 years. It's quite impressive. Justinian's death left the empire with several things, not necessarily good. For one, his general Belisarius conquered a large amount of territory. That's great. But it's one thing to conquer territory, and it's quite another to protect it. Bankrupted their treasury. Constant warfare, guess what, is very expensive. And a smaller population than when he began, which is very strange. Now, I think that's just referring to the city of Constantinople. And a smaller population doesn't necessarily relate to losing wars. In fact, I think that relates to the plague, which we'll be talking about the plague at length in just a few minutes. All right. So, the Byzantine Empire after Justinian. So first off, there's some problems. And the first person I want to mention is Heraclius. Heraclius, the next emperor following Justinian, had to face attacks from the Persians and constant attacks. You see, as people were migrating for various reasons, a large group of people move into an area, there's no room for them. There's already people living there. There's, of course, one of our basic reasons for conflict. And so Heraclius, his first challenge was to develop a good defense system. He set up a system where he was the commander-in-chief, much like our president is the commander-in-chief in times of war. Now, the War Powers Act in 1975 limits the president's authority to wage war, but the reason that a president is also considered the commander-in-chief is if, I don't know, Red Dawn were to happen and the North Koreans actually did show up in California, as unlikely as that may be, the president has the power to act instantly and to send troops without hesitation. In fact, he can keep troops in an area without telling a soul for up to 48 hours, which is why JFK developed the whole idea of covert ops was based on that 48-hour window. The troops can be anywhere in the world for 48 hours, and the president doesn't have to tell a soul. Of course, as you know, bin Laden, did anybody know about that? No, he just appeared on the news. Hey, we killed bin Laden, by the way. Been working on that for years. Awesome, thumbs up. And that commander-in-chief model. Now, the difference here between a commander-in-chief and a dictator is that this man still did have limits to his power. But being that he had absolute control of the military, that has problems of its own. Think of Nixon, for example. Think of, I could go on. Think of Lyndon Johnson even, from the other side. So, another thing Heraclius realized is that restoring the Roman Empire was simply not feasible. It's not possible. It's too much territory to control. Most people didn't consider themselves Roman who were living over in these areas at that point. And so you can't make people be something they don't want to be. Think of Afghanistan. I had friends who fought there. We were there for a very long time. Their recent election is up. It may or may not go well. The election right now is one of the most heavily guarded things and is also under constant attack. So do they want democracy? Remains to be seen. Again, we can't force that on them. We can't force that on anybody. But something else that Heraclius had to deal with is the rise of Islam. Something we'll talk about in a moment is that the Byzantine Empire was very much a Christian empire, very heavily so, to an extreme degree in many cases. And they saw the rise of Islam in their territory as a threat. And Byzantine armies were quite successful, as we talked about with the rise of Islam much earlier in the course. Next, as I said, the idea of maintaining a large empire sounds great in theory. But people desire independence. People don't always want to be part of a large empire. Did anybody happen to hear the drama about Texas threatening to secede when Obama was reelected? Anybody hear that? Am I the only one? Of course, I didn't take them seriously because I'm like, oh, they're Texas, whatever. But sorry if you're from Texas. But they threatened to secede. Yeah. Wait, they're part of America. Well, yeah, so did Vermont. Vermont constantly threatens to secede. So does Scotland. In fact, England's told Scotland they can do whatever they want if they want to secede. And so the Bulgars were one of the first kingdoms to secede from Constantinople. And finally, by the 8th century, by 700, the Byzantine Empire was kind of done with the old Western Roman Empire. They were really seen as backward. Kind of like how West Germans saw East Germans during the Cold War. Okay, so I'm going to kind of camp out on this slide for just a few minutes. First off, the Byzantine Empire in the 8th century. It's a Greek state. These folks spoke Greek. In fact, after the Great Schism, the religion they practiced was called Greek Orthodox Christianity. Very much a Christian state, very much so. Considerable amount of resources and talent devoted to Christianity. Most of their art, most of their writing, structured around Christianity. In fact, most of the good drama from the Byzantine Empire relates to religious debates, such as the iconoclastic controversy. Say that 3 times. Really, it just has to do with, can you paint a picture of Jesus? Well, can you? When I paint a picture of Jesus, what's he look like? What color is his skin? White, really? But he's supposed to be olive, right? Supposed to have curly hair, big nose. He was a Jew. He was a Semite. But wait, Jesus is like superstar Jesus, right? Super good looking. Um, right, yeah, it just depends on the painting, but I've never seen a Jesus with abs, but I'm not going to dispute you on that, but yeah, we'll go with it. But the point is can you paint a picture of Jesus? Can you paint a picture of God? Are you supposed to be able to? Well, the Muslims say no, period, no. Not at all. You cannot paint God. You cannot draw him. You cannot put any image. They take that whole commandment, which they do read the Old Testament, by the way. They revere it as much as they do the Quran. They take that idea of no graven images very seriously. And that's where this iconoclastic controversy came from. Can you paint a picture of Jesus? Well, sure. My picture of Jesus, he's holding little lambs and, patting kids on the head. But can you? Now, while that may seem silly to us, if I've offended you, I'm sorry. But that split the Christian church and became the first major split of the Christian church. People were charging the Eastern Orthodox, which is what they later called themselves, they called them idolaters, saying, you're making graven images. This is a golden calf. I had some pictures that I had taken when I was in Brazil of icons. I just forgot to do it. I have a friend who's actually an Eastern Orthodox, I don't know what they call themselves. He calls himself a patriarch. Anyway, he's a preacher of Eastern Orthodox. And neat guy. But their justification. How many people do you think could read back in the Byzantine Empire? A lot less than today. You think public education, for all its faults, teaches folks how to read. But with very little education back then, very few people could read or write. But everyone can look at a picture. Before I've even learned any Bible verses, I was looking at pictures of Jesus. And that's communicated something. And that was exactly their justification. However, those opposed to it called themselves the iconoclast. And they had the similar arguments to Islam, as I've already illustrated. But the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at this time was Leo III. And he, in fact, outlawed the use of icons, period, just by decree. Later reversed this, in fact. And something else going on at that time was there was a lot of drama between who's boss of the church. The Byzantines had a person called the Patriarch they revered as their boss. And of course, there's the Pope. And so why did he reverse his decision about icons? Was it through careful study of the Bible and deep reflection? No. It was to throw political weight to the Patriarch. Okay. The whole outlawing of icons was completely opposed by the Roman popes. And this is something that it's kind of tricky to understand, but Roman popes and Byzantine patriarchs did not like each other. In fact, there were several cases we'll talk about in a few moments where there were multiple popes, 2 different cases where they called each other the Antichrist, and 1 case where they excommunicated each other. Some of my favorite stories. Now, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at this time was seen as the protector of religion. And he was seen as chosen by God, which again, when I showed that painting of Justinian in your book, he not only had the halo effect going on, he had the ball, which somehow symbolized divine sovereignty, but really it gets me as the halo effect. He's been anointed by God, chosen by him. And this is his justification for absolute power. In fact, European monarchs are going to use that argument for a very long time, until the Enlightenment and the whole experiment of the United States and a lot of neat stuff we'll talk about if we get to it. So, finally, Orthodox Christianity, this very strict adherence to it, was the unifying force. Byzantine Empire. Okay, now intellectual life in the Byzantine Empire. So, which by the way, when you finish your test, these PowerPoints are accessible. I don't know if you ever noticed that, but they open up magically for you when you finish your test. So if ever you just want these for your own benefit, because I put a lot of work into them, you're welcome to them, but I did choose to wait until you finish the test, because I want you to actually take notes in here if possible. Okay, so for one, intellectual life during the Middle Ages or even during the Byzantine Empire really focused on looking back at the Greeks and Romans in a big way. In fact, they wrote in the same style as the Greeks and Romans. There was a quote in your book, some Eastern Orthodox writer said that Jesus is my Savior, but Virgil is the master of the English language. I think it may be a Cicero, but anyway, you get the point. Now, one of the most famous historians of the Byzantine Empire was a man named Procopius. He was the court historian. He, in fact, traveled with Belisarius on these military campaigns. His most famous work is, guess what, called The Wars. That's what people wrote about, these historians. They were commissioned by kings to write their memoirs, their glories in battle. You can read Julius Caesar's memoirs, his glories in battle. You can even read Greek stories of battle from Herodotus or Thucydides, or these guys just write about battles. Even think of Chronicles in the Old Testament. But the Wars is the story of Justinian's reconquest of the Roman Empire. Quite impressive when you think about it. That, at least in a military standpoint, has not been repeated. That's kind of cool, right? Has not been repeated. Justinian was the last to rebuild the Roman Empire. You know, Mussolini tried. He was kind of crazy. They drug him through the street and killed him. He was the last to actually try to physically rebuild the Roman Empire. Plenty of people call themselves Caesar. In fact, that's where the word Tsar came from, the Russian rulers. But anyway, now life in Constantinople. It was the largest city in Europe in the Middle Ages. However, if you remember when we talked about Islam, Baghdad is like Constantinople to the 10th power. You know, I can't remember their population, but Baghdad was a population of some 5 million, which at that time is, gosh, that's half in New York, guys, for the Middle Ages, seriously. Anyway, it was the hub of Europe, which is why I use the word New York. It is the commercial hub of Europe, Constantinople is. And for one, you just need to look at its location. There. Between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. As we know about early peoples, they tend to locate near bodies of water. Coastal areas are great for travel and trade. And if you can happen to locate yourself between two huge bodies of water, they could literally put up a chain between the channel. They could tax people. If they didn't pay the tax, they put up the chain and they literally block them. So it's kind of neat. Next, they're the exchange hub for goods, going from the east to the west and so forth. And they also imported many raw materials, such as silk. In fact, neat story in your book about silk. China kind of cornered the market on silk for a very long time. And the silk manufacturing process was a closely guarded secret in China until two monks stole the idea, set up a silk factory, and started making a ton of money off of it. I just love that it was two monks that did that, by the way. Did you hear about the old lady, the nun, that broke into Watts Bar about a month ago? Yeah, just look it up, seriously. Anyway, I don't have time. The nun broke into Watts Bar, almost got to where we store nuclear bombs. A nun, 83 years old. Wasn't trying to hurt anything. She's just a nun, making a point. She put peace signs all over it, but I just think it's pretty cool. All right, our next painting is Mary and Jesus. This one always gets me, and I did have to drag the image, so it's not quite to scale. But baby Jesus, in a lot of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox religions, has a big head. I don't know why. The emphasis is not on realism in these pictures. The emphasis is on communicating the divinity and otherworldliness. In fact, just to point out, These are two saints to the left and right of Mary, and then two angels up there again. And remember, just like our other paintings, they've got the halo effect going on. And Islamic art. This is about as religious as Islamic art is allowed to get. This is a verse from the Quran, made to look like a mosque. This isn't a great example of calligraphy, so I just think that was pretty interesting. All right. The zenith of Byzantine civilization. Zenith means the height. This is as good as it gets. During the reign of Michael III, iconoclasm, the dispute about icons, was abolished. There were reforms in education and in the military, the economy. This is as wealthy as the Byzantine Empire got, though, of course, their height and glory in terms of military prowess and size dates back to Justinian, but in terms of real economic prosperity and culture, we're looking at it. Of course, there's still problems. For one, Arabs and Bulgars constantly attack. I even had a friend who was Bulgarian, and they're Slavic people, so they look very much Russian. And never made the connection because I was about where you guys were in school, so I didn't understand that. But now if I saw him today, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, you guys rebelled from the Byzantine Empire back in 750," and he'd be like, "Yeah," and he wouldn't care. But anyway, the Bulgars and the Arabs attacked constantly, and of course there were still more religious disputes. I know this one wasn't what carpet to put in a church. This was actually Pope or Patriarch. Who do we obey? There were constant power problems, and this is, again, perhaps, I'm guessing here, but I think this is a big part of the reason why our founding fathers advocated a strict separation of church and state. And that's written into the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. Why? Because when we see the mixture of the two, there are lots of problems. For example, Pope or Patriarch. Do we follow the Pope in Rome, or do we ignore that guy and follow the Patriarch in Constantinople? Now, for one, the revised Nicene Creed caused the Patriarch to receive a lot of criticism. And the revised Nicene Creed said that the Holy Spirit came from the Father and the Son, instead of from the Father alone. I'm not going to go into that in a great deal because it's a survey course, but in general, they were debating the essence of the Trinity. And because I think it was the Pope that supported this, correct me if I'm wrong, the entire Eastern Church decided that the Pope needed to go. That the Pope was not only not to be listened to, he was a heretic and to be excommunicated and sentenced to hell. That's a big deal. If you excommunicate anybody in the Catholic Church, if you're a strict dogmatic Catholic, the belief is that person's going to hell. So the phrase "go to hell" is an actual real curse in this setting. And they excommunicated the Pope. This, of course, divided the church big time. Next, in the Macedonian dynasty, after Michael III, several big achievements here. For one, farmers were able to strengthen their position. I had to read that sentence several times to really understand that. What they meant by free farmers is that these were folks who were not serfs, they were not slaves, they were able to own their own land, and they were the backbone of the Byzantine military. So these were free citizens who, in times of war, would be drafted and called upon for service, and these were the backbone of the military. And so, anyway, my point is that these folks were able to expand their position. Next, better trade relations with Europe, expanded trade, so forth. And then, of course, for the Byzantine Empire, their big priority was spreading Christianity. I mean, you read anything from this time period, it's all heavily religious. And their big success in terms of spreading Christianity was to convert the Prince of Russia, then called Kiev, to Christianity. And so Russia has remained heavily an Eastern Orthodox state until the suppression of Christianity during the Cold War and so forth. Some political and military achievements of this time period. For one, very strong civil service, meaning that there was a culture strongly supporting the emperor. It was felt that the emperor, again, was the protector of religion. And some very skilled emperors, too. These guys weren't jokes. In fact, in many ways, Plato argued that a enlightened monarch is better than a democracy. I'm not here advocating for totalitarianism, but my point is that at least Plato's argument is that if you have an actual good leader, you can have a very stable government. And for a time, they had very good leaders. Leo the Sixth, called Leo the Wise, completely regulated and systematized. I can't say that word. Systematized. Basically, made trade more efficient, and also codified all Byzantine laws. So how Justinian wrote down all of these Roman laws, he codified it, meaning he gave them the list of laws. That was Leo the Wise. Next was Basil II. Finally defeated the Bulgars, annexed that part of Bulgaria, and by his death, the Byzantine Empire was the largest it had been since the time of Justinian. Okay, next. So, as I was saying, landowners, the common people, saw many advancements during this time period. For one, landowners were able to gain greater control over their own individual estates. However, as we've seen before, permanent war drains resources, and as we've seen with these splits in religion, this growing division causes serious problems. In fact, the Pope tries again to reassert his authority over the Christian church, and at this time, they've already tried to excommunicate a pope, and so at this time it was just too late. The Pope and this patriarch actually excommunicated each other when the Pope tried to reassert his authority over the Byzantine Empire. So this is, it's quite strange, really, that you have two people of seemingly equal power both banishing the other. All right, so back to Islam. As I said, the Byzantines viewed the growth of Islam as a threat, very much so. And to be fair to them, it was an Islamic civilization that overthrew them, the Ottoman Turks. Now, the Ottoman Turks, which today are the residents of Turkey, hence the name, came from a group of nomads in Central Asia called the Seljuks, Seljuk Turks. They moved into the Islamic parts of the empire, moved into captured Baghdad, converted to Islam early on. And they were very effective warriors. Their military was extremely effective for many reasons, but for one, they used gunpowder. And many of the Byzantine armies were still fighting with castle walls and armored knights and swords, etc., which that culture of war doesn't die out for a very long time. But my point is that gunpowder is going to revolutionize warfare, make castle walls and armored knights obsolete, and warriors that have them very effective. Now, one of the last dynasties of the Byzantine Empire was headed by a man named Comnenus. I'm going to try to pronounce his first name. He managed to stop the Turks for a time, led several successful campaigns, and for a time rebuilt the Byzantine Empire. But you notice up there in big bold words the decline and fall of the Byzantine Empire, and the last date there is 1453. And as we've talked about also before with the Crusades do have a very important role to play here. For one, when the First Crusade happened, it occurred because communists requested help in fighting the Turks, which were slowly migrating into Anatolia, which today is called Turkey. So we can tell who won. And so here is the Emperor of Constantinople requesting help from the Pope. But you got to remember that the Pope doesn't really like the Eastern Orthodox religion, right? It wasn't that long ago that they excommunicated each other. And so my point is that the Pope is not looking out for the Byzantine Empire, maybe like they had back in the day. Now, when we had a unified Roman Empire pre-476, then it was seen as one place. And then even for a very long time, until that great schism, until that big split, that religious split, it was still seen as sort of one Christian empire. But now, when communists ask Pope Urban for help, what's Pope Urban do? He says, God wills it, we're going to retake the Holy Land, and we're going to attack Jerusalem. Meanwhile, communists is going, no, we're up here. And he's sending troops way down here. He's going, no, help, please. So the first thing communist tries to do is say, well, okay, if you're going to use these armies to reconquer the Holy Land, at least you're killing Muslims, so I guess that's good. Will you at least consider making these lands you conquer part of the Byzantine Empire? Nobody listened to that idea. Completely ignored it. And we've already heard the stories of the Crusades. First one successful, they held Jerusalem for 100 years, retaken by Salah ad-Din. The second and third to retake Jerusalem, unsuccessful. And the fourth, I just said, sacked Constantinople, which maybe didn't mean a lot at the time. But in the Fourth Crusade, and these crusaders believed they were doing God's work. Just had to say that. They believed, the individual warriors truly believed that if they died on crusade, they were going to go straight to heaven. Poof. But the new crusading army became involved in a dispute about who is to be the next ruler of Constantinople. And the leader of the crusade was a person from Venice, which we'll talk about Venice in just a moment. Hopefully we'll have time. And they saw this as an opportunity to get rid of a competitor. Venice was emerging, and in fact, they're the city to talk about during the Renaissance. They were emerging as a great commercial power. And if you've ever seen any mafia movies, maybe you've heard of the Medici family, which is where the Italian mafia supposedly descended from. The Medici family orchestrated the sack of Constantinople. So you think the mafia's got clout? They sacked that city. Okay, go back and watch Godfather for homework. If you haven't seen mafia movies, you need to. Now let's finally talk about the fall of Constantinople. Okay, so for one, the empire gained from the Crusades fell. The Crusader states did not last long. 100 years, not long in the grand scheme of things. One more emperor managed to retake Constantinople after the sack from the Crusaders. His name was Michael Pelagius. He saved the Byzantine Empire, and it lasted for another 190 years. But finally, it was taken by the Ottoman Turks. And this was these folks who had lived in Anatolia now. And by this time, I need another map here. They essentially had Constantinople completely surrounded. There was nothing left of the empire but a city-state. So the man who actually gets the credit for conquering Constantinople is named Mehmed II. And he had an army of 80,000 Turkish soldiers. More importantly, he had big cannons. And I had to point this out. Your book mentions that while Constantinople had 13 miles of land walls and chains that could stretch across the entire channel, the Turks had cannons. And they had one that had the capability to fire cannonballs that weighed 1,200 pounds. which if you can imagine, a half-ton truck, and then two of those things. I have a hard time visualizing a ton. Maybe a dump truck, 1,200 pounds? I don't know. Anyway, my point is it could fire a dump truck. And that was in 1453. You fire a dump truck at pretty much anything, and it's going to do some damage. So after so many dump trucks fired at the walls fell. Mehmed II ordered a full-on massive attack. 4,000 more defenders died. And I just think it's neat to note that the emperor was killed along with the defenders. That whoever it was defending that city had the guts to go out and fight with his people. Do my best to finish up, or at least we'll get as far as we can with the time we have. I want to briefly talk about the Black Death. And I'm assuming that you guys already have some foreknowledge of this, so I'll be brief. For one, it struck most of Eurasia, meaning Europe, Asia, and even in North Africa. Spread by fleas that lived on rats. This began because of the Mongol invasions. These rats actually followed the Mongol armies because this originated in China. And as the Mongols conquered China and then went on to conquer a good chunk of the rest of the world, they also brought this plague with them. Now, the Mongols did not intentionally spread the plague. Well, that's debatable because they would actually throw plague victims into cities for biological warfare. So maybe they did intentionally spread the plague. But something else ironic about the Mongols is that when they did conquer pretty much the whole world, at least for their time, and they did make it safe. It was said that a woman could carry a bag of jewels from one part of the empire to the other and not be attacked. Why? Because the Mongols knew how to punish some thieves. They knew how to punish anybody. Nobody messed with them. And so because of that ease of travel and trade, so many people were traveling and trading. And guess where the rats went? On boats. And they went all over the world. And so your book goes into more detail about how the plague spread, but in general, wherever the boats went, that's where the plague went. The plague didn't make its way to the Western Hemisphere because the boats weren't going to the Western Hemisphere at that time. 60% mortality in some places. It's estimated that as many as 38 million Europeans may have died. But in fact, what often gets left out is that probably about 40 million Chinese died as well. You think the Holocaust is bad. Multiply that by a lot. The only thing that comes close in modern times is the flu pandemic of the 1920s, which is actually 1919, mysteriously disappeared after a year. If you're into weird health scares, 30 million people died because of the flu pandemic in a year. So the plague did last over a period of time. Crowded cities were the worst hit for reasons you can understand. In some cases, entire villages disappeared. Watched a really neat movie recently about the effect of the fear and just what this did to people in the Middle Ages. And I don't remember the name of the movie. If you're interested, I can try to figure it out. It's on Netflix, but it freaked people out. One that I really like in terms of a neat case study on fear is Stephen King's The Mist. If you've ever seen it, it was a made-for-TV movie. It's really good. It just goes into like what people do when they get extremely afraid. And if you've ever been in situations where people are truly very scared for their lives, I don't want to exaggerate, but I've been there a few times. And it's weird to see people break down in those types of situations. For example, there were people that called themselves flagellants. They firmly believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and that the only way they could cleanse themselves and their neighbors of the plague was to beat themselves and beat each other. Monty Python makes fun of this. I don't know if you've ever seen the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the plague scene, and I think I skipped it for time's sake. Maybe, did we watch it already? Anyway, it's the one where they are walking around beating themselves in the head and saying some Latin words. And the point is those were flagellants. It creates a bit of mass hysteria because these folks weren't just like hitting themselves in the head, haha, that's funny. No, they were actually like tearing chunks of skin out of their back. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Da Vinci Code, but the murderer in that was a flatulent. and he would beat himself. It's quite graphic, really. It's gross. But another thing that happened during the plague. So one thing about fear is you begin to grow superstitious. Another thing about fear is you begin to blame other people. Having been an outdoor guide for a very long time, I'm very accustomed to this. When people get afraid, that's the first thing they do is blame me, their guide. Why? Well, because I'm the guy who got them into this. No, they're the people who paid me to get them into this. So, yes, let's look for somebody to blame. Who do we blame? Let's blame the Jews. Oh, yes, there was a Holocaust and the Black Death. Why not? Jews were accused of starting the plague. Now, did they really? That's ridiculous. If you want to blame anybody, blame the Mongols. But in Germany, they actually exterminated 60 Jewish communities. And no, that's not the 1930s. That's the Black Death. In fact, many Jews fled to Russia because of this persecution. Ironically, in the 1800s, they're going to flee from Russia for the very same persecution to the United States. And lastly, a few effects of the plague, and I'll be brief. For one, the population shrunk in a real and tangible way. The population declined to the point that there was a labor shortage, there was a food surplus, the price of food was actually going down, and in a strange way, this caused quite a few social changes as well, such as peasants gaining greater freedoms because, well, for one, there were fewer of them, and their work was needed more. Okay. Just wanted to point out from this painting that they still have coffins at this point. I didn't write down the date of this painting, but the caption also made note that after a while they just started having to put people in mass graves. Okay, so next, and I'm trying to summarize as best I can, the 100 Years' War. I actually spent about an hour on this one slide today, so just to emphasize, this takes longer to do it this way, quite a bit. And for one, I was curious about how the war started. Like, what was this beef that started a war that lasted 100 years? Well, to be brief, England owned part of France, but the deal was that France had to England had to do what France told them to. The King of France was considered a vassal to the French king, and the territory in question was Gascony. France tried to retake this territory. The English king declared war over this little part of France, and that war lasted 100 years. And like any war, it began with enthusiasm, meaning that folks were pretty excited about it at first. Now, early on, the English were kicking butt. And in fact, in many ways, they were the underdogs. The French nobility had a large number of heavy cavalry that made up most of the nobility, most of the dukes, squires, knights, etc. And the main core of the English army, and this is the Battle of Crecy, was longbowmen and guys carrying spears called pikemen. And they were professional soldiers. These weren't just, conscripts or draftees. They were paid warriors, but they did not have that heavy plated armor that the French knights carried. Now, in this first battle, the knights, the typical strategy, if you have a big bunch of heavily armored knights, is to just run down the enemy. There's not a lot of strategy to it. You just get on one side, run them down. You put your lances in front. They try to fight you with swords, but you're wearing armor, so you laugh at them and you run them over. The irony here is that the field they tried to run across was muddy. And so that was automatically putting them at a disadvantage, but also the English longbowmen have a much greater range than any other projectile weapon at that point. And while it does require some skill to use, they're fairly inexpensive. A full suit of armor and the horse to go with it cost more than a really nice house at that time. But a longbow, if you know what you're doing, cost a tree and some animal gut. And you have a longbow. Now, granted, it takes some skill to make that happen. The most famous example of this is the Battle of Agincourt. immortalized in Shakespeare's Henry V. If you're not familiar with that, at least watch the movie sometime. And in the Battle of Agincourt, same thing, knights try to charge, and the longbows decimate them. Now, the turning point in this war is due to a woman named Joan of Arc. And I'm sure you've heard of this woman. She claimed that God was telling her to free the French from the English, who at this point in the war were winning. And with the help of gunpowder cannons, the French began to win. But also very much inspired by Joan of Arc's example. And she was just filled of religious fervor, claiming that God had told her to liberate the French. Now, guess who captured her? Some English people. And guess who tried her? English courts. Granted, Catholic English courts. Declared her a heretic, burned her at the stake. Results of the 100 Years' War. For one, this is effectively ended feudalism. Professional soldiers were hired instead of the feudal system. Because the feudal system based on land and fiefs and vassals and knights, etc., it's cheaper to just hire people to fight. Call them sellswords, if you will. And so it really ended that whole feudal era. States had a part to play, so did the plague, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, next, the decline of the church. And I'm not going to get to everything I hope to today, but that's okay. King Philip of France claimed the right to tax the clergy. This is a strange thing. The Pope tried to resist this. The Pope was in Rome at this time. The King of France claimed that he had the right to tax the church. The church said no. So what did the King of France do? We sent troops and captured the Pope. Now the Pope escaped in this situation. But actually, apparently, the turmoil of having to run through the woods, I don't know what happened. He died of shock while he was running from these French troops. And a new pope was set up in France, in Avignon. And this caused some enormous drama. Every pope since Jesus had been Italian, except for Jesus. And they had all been Italian, because at that time, they were Roman. And then the Italian pope tradition continued until this French pope. And the Italians really didn't like that. And this led to a great schism here between Western Europe and Rome, if you will, Central Europe. The Italians, when the papacy moved back to Rome, Italians threatened the Catholic Church and said, we're going to kill you all. We're going to storm the church, St. Peter's Basilica, and kill you if you don't pick an Italian pope. So guess what? God chose an Italian pope. Now, this did divide Europe, because for a time, there was a French pope, and in fact, after the Italian pope was chosen, the French chose a second pope. So here we are again with two more popes, and this is a bad thing. Moving on. Renaissance in 3 minutes. Here we go. I don't even know if I want to try. So the Renaissance is simply Latin for rebirth. And generally, as we're moving out of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance is very much an intellectual movement. And so that's why I had this question at the bottom, was there a Renaissance for women? In fact, your book asks that question, has some neat discussion there. Because generally, when we talk about the Renaissance as an intellectual movement, you got to remember that over 80% of the people can't read. And so where is this intellectual movement going on? Well, that's within the aristocracy. But still, people are beginning to question many things. Catholic Church, for one. Religion in general, even. And even beginning to emphasize humanism, meaning an emphasis in worldly achievements, instead of the sort of Middle Ages concept of life may be crappy, but at least you're going to heaven. People began to focus on improving their lives here. For example, artists began to really reflect this time period with portrayals of the human body, realistic portrayals of the human body. Also, just wanted to briefly show you a few paintings here. Da Vinci's Last Supper, there's a very famous painting. I'm sure you've seen it before. But the idea with this one is that a person's character can be depicted in a picture. And if you study this closely, then each of these people represent a different personality. And it was Da Vinci's impression of what the Bible told us about each of the different disciples. Next painting, Raphael's School of Athens. This painting is very idealized, very beautiful, if you will. Although the perspective in it's quite astounding. If I had more time, we'd go into, how this is portrayed as very distant, but it's a 2D painting. It's very neat. And then finally, Donatello. I was going to make the picture bigger, and then I realized there was huge genitalia right in the front. I'm just like, all right, I'm going to move on. But the point is that Michelangelo's David, I've heard it's smaller in real life, the David is smaller in real life. But the idea is it's the ideal human being. And he wanted to exalt the beauty of the human body. So, almost done. Wanted to briefly discuss the Italian states and their influence in the Renaissance. In fact, when Constantinople fell to the Turks, the real commercial hub, the economic hub of Europe, shifted over to Italy, in Venice and then later in Florence. Okay, and in Western Europe, something very interesting was going on. For one, the influence of the Pope was declining. During the Middle Ages, the Pope was the supreme political and religious head of the church as well as Western Europe. But that began to change. And individual kings here, each of these people began to assert their power in different ways. Ferdinand of Aragon, he's the one who commissioned Columbus's voyage, who later helped to build one of the largest overseas empires in history. Isabella of Castile, his wife. The two together formed a very, very powerful combination. Henry VII of England, extremely popular through low taxes, and later his successor, Henry VIII, would completely leave the Catholic Church entirely. Okay, now on to Germany, and this is our last slide, and we're almost done. The Holy Roman Empire was completely falling apart. You may remember some discussion of Charlemagne and how he was able to build this Holy Roman Empire and how it represented a close connection with the Pope, and that was falling apart. Germany was essentially, by the Renaissance, a collection of independent states, which we'll talk about the Reformation soon, Martin Luther and his whole business, and he benefited from this decentralization. There was one ruling family, the Habsburgs, however, in the Holy Roman Empire, who had such a large estate that it became the country of Austria. Now, finally, let's get rid of the Mongols once and for all. The last country to declare their independence from the Mongols was Russia, and that was under Ivan II. And finally, once and for all, declared their independence.